you've got a tale of two offensives peculiarly at the moment. You've got the Ukrainians going into Russian territory in Kursk, as we've been discussing, and we've got the push forward round Pokrovka, and the Chavy Yar axis to push to these hubs, which do control a big logistics junctions. They're working on that, but they're using old tactics. They're using heavy metal. They're using a lot of infantry, and there's a lot of controversy, which the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian psychological warfare is playing on very heavily, that they're bringing up conscripts and getting conscripts to sign on as trained soldiers, which they are far from, because this is absolutely clear. They understand this and they will work on it, the Ukrainians. Putin does not want to have a general mobilization, a general declaration of martial law. It's a military dictatorship anyway in Russia, but he doesn't want to state the blindingly obvious, because if he states the blindingly obvious, and our friend Zakharova, she's the wonderful gobby spokeswoman on foreign affairs, on public national media, if they have to say, well, we are at war now and we need a mass mobilization. Well, what the hell have you been doing for the last 2.5 years? It hasn't been going so well. I think that that's the message that the Ukrainians are very keen to get through. It's not going so well because most of Russia is still not touched by the aspect that they're in a messy situation, which is making their lives worse.
The slow advances towards Pokrovsk in the Donbass continues, and President Zelensky likened that this week to the battle for Bakhmut and said Russia would throw tens of thousands of troops at it should it want to. Do you think that President Putin will do this because he actually needs a battlefield success right now?
He's got to do an audit, and he must be doing it, but one doesn't know who is informing him. You know, what is the value of the commitment of troops there? Really, how good is the ordnance, the logistics, the chain, the defense industrial aspect of it? It's going gangbusters, so much so that currently the Russian economy is assessed at being growing by 3%. But it's an artificial growth. It's based entirely on this ramping up of, 40% of all public funding is going towards defense at the moment. And really, that should produce a war machine which should utterly overwhelm Ukraine, and yet it's not working. Of course, the Russian defense is it's the Weasley West. It's all these wonderful weapons, but in fact, they're not as copious as they're made out to be. So, to look at Putin's got to find a winning strategy and a winning team. And being Putin, he always sticks with the old team. He's stuck with Gerasimov. Yep. And he's, even put his former bodyguard in charge of the counter operations in Kursk, Damian and Alexei. And they got to such a state that within days of him announcing that, he said, oh, no. After all, it's going to be run by a committee of 4, the defense of the Kursk pocket. And the troops are not mainstream troops. By and large, they're FSB, former KGB, in other words, security force troops, and Roskadia, National Guard Gendarmerie. So there's something that really isn't working there.
At the moment, as things stand, today, Thursday, the 29th of August, it's being judged as a very risky but bold but risky move, I should say, by the Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine's armed forces. Why do you think he would do it now?
He's rolled the dice. And remember, it's not only a kinetic war, a war on the ground and a war in the air, it's an information war as well. And this is something that he, and particularly Budanov, the director of intelligence and the director of an awful lot more, including the psychological warfare. And he is really very sophisticated and has learnt the lessons from last year. They're trying to undermine the confidence of Russia. At a grand strategic level, they're playing mind games with Vladimir Putin. And that is, from what one gathers, it is having some success. There's a much less confident Putin. He's going all over the place. Let's work on this front and that front. What are we going to do in the Baltic? What are we going to do with Moldova? What are we going to do to upset the elections in Georgia? Watch this space.
It's really interesting because it does seem in response Russia has resumed these intense series of drone and missile attacks on Ukraine, in particular on its energy infrastructure. Why the concentration on this, for example, rather than a pushback to defend inside Russia itself?
This is very difficult because it's still on the offensive. You've got a tale of two offensives peculiarly at the moment. You've got the Ukrainians going into Russian territory in Kursk, as we've been discussing, and we've got the push forward run Pokrovka, that and the Chavy Yar axis to push to these hubs which do control a big logistics junctions. They're working on that, but they're using old tactics. They're using heavy metal. They're using a lot of infantry, and there's a lot of controversy, which the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian psychological warfare is playing on very heavily, that they're bringing up conscripts and getting conscripts to sign on as trained soldiers, which they are far from, because this is absolutely clear, and they understand this, and they will work on it, the Ukrainians. Putin does not want to have a general mobilization, a general declaration of martial law. It's a military dictatorship anyway in Russia, but he doesn't want to state the blindingly obvious, because if he states the blindingly obvious, and our friend Zakharova, she's the wonderful gobby spokeswoman on foreign affairs, on public national media, if they have to say, well, we are at war now and we need a mass mobilization. Well, what the hell have you been doing for the last 2.5 years? It hasn't been going so well. I think that that's the message that the Ukrainians are very keen to get through. It's not going so well because most of Russia is still not touched by the aspect that they're in a messy situation, which is making their lives worse.
It's test fired. Ukraine's test fired its own ballistic missile. It's going to be a while potentially, isn't it, before it actually has it? And
never say that about Ukraine. Never say that about
Ukraine.
That's
true.
Look at the innovation. Do you remember the Bayraktar T2, the Whiz Turkish drone? It was completely used very effectively by the Ukrainians in the opening stages of the war back in 22. It was completely out of date, completely outmoded, completely overtaken, even particularly by Ukrainian technology, within months, if not weeks. And they are they shame a lot of the Western countries, and particularly the British defence industry setup, in the adroitness, the astuteness with what they're doing, and particularly down at the front. Ballistic missile next year, don't count on it. I'll bet they'll have a really good go at doing it this year.
Okay, so President Zelensky, and we again this week we've had repeated requests from the Ukrainians to be able to be used storm shadows to hit inside, to get that permission to hit inside to Russia. You're saying you think that's tacitly kind of on the cards, right?
Yes, because I think what Zelensky will bang on about, and who could blame him, is getting permission to use the various American equipment like ATACMS. Certainly, they've been using multi-launch rocket system, I would think, in the Kursk battle. So they've been going into Russia. But there is the AGM-158 JASSM, JASSM, which is more powerful than Taurus, the German version, and Storm Shadow. They'd really like to have a bit of a go at that. But can I just quickly say that I think Zelensky is brilliant at this, because you have to think he's talking a lot about this. Let's work out what he's not talking about. And I think in air defense, they're beginning to get the F-16s really working.
Yeah, and we saw them working, didn't we, to defend Kyiv only in the last few days, in perhaps a small way, but it is starting, and that they were used to counter these drone and missile attacks.
And that's primarily their role. Their role is not deep strike. then they're not going to use them, I would think, primarily in a fighter bomber role. The F-16 is an amazing plane because it has been, over its history, incredibly versatile, and you can use them for a deep strike, but that would be expensive and it would be risky. What they want them for, I would suspect initially, as air defenders, to bring down the Sukhois coming in and launching standoff weapons. But they've got to go even further back. These heavy bombers, the Tupolovs, that are coming up from bases well to the east of Moscow, which is a sign of some success of the Ukrainians, is that they're forcing the air bases further and further back. I would say, before we talk next, I think watch for a bridge or two more to be dropped. I'll bet they really have a go at the Kerch Bridge again and try and cut off Crimea.
Famously, he does not tolerate dissent. Does the fact that you've now got people coming out feeling more free to criticize the regime in the Kremlin, does that show that maybe Putin's position is severely undermined now?
Well, I'm not sure that they feel more free. I think they're very upset and they can't stand it any longer, and they're doing it regardless. So the latest one is another militia mercenary head, and he's come out on video just as Prigozhin. Do we all remember Prigozhin last year? He came out criticizing Putin and the war, asked for an end to the war. His mercenaries were in there fighting, as are this guy's. And of course, he staged a very brief mutiny and was eventually assassinated. Despite that, another guy has come forward publicly, very courageously. And, you got to remember that they have a military in the government of Russia, but there are hundreds of private militias like Prigozhin had that are owned by oligarchs. And so they could get together and he's demanding that the army overthrow Putin. That's what he's saying, overthrow him. He's also talking about the enormous social problems that this has caused for Russian people. I mean, he's obviously setting himself up. He wants a coup. He wants a coup d'etat. And then there's another prominent oligarch who's also publicly come out very strongly against the war and also calling for it to end. And he's probably backed by other oligarchs. So what you're seeing, and then there's a third fellow who's a very important inner circle guy who's been demoted because he said a few things. He hasn't come out in favor of overthrowing Putin, but he's created problems for Putin. So Putin still remains a dictator. It still would require an army mutiny or a coup d'etat by the military to probably get rid of him, unless he feels forced or is forced physically to leave. It's a big development.
I mean, I don't know. To me, it seems hard to imagine Putin voluntarily leaving power because he will think he is safest in power, surely.
Well, maybe he will find out that he isn't, and he has children and a family, and there's a lot of very violent people in Russia, and many of whom work for him. And we've seen in the past that if you're a dictator and you have any slippage, you're surrounded by ruthless people. They'll get rid of you just as you got rid of them if they were wrong stepping. So, he can't be all that secure. I think another thing that's interesting psychologically is that the Ukrainians about 3 weeks ago leaked the fact that they had the ability to assassinate Putin at a big naval parade in a certain city in Russia, went to the Pentagon to ask for permission because they needed to use American weaponry, were refused, okay? What that means is it was disappointing for many people, I guess, but the point is that by leaking it, they made it very clear to Mr. Putin, they'll get him if they can. And they were only prevented from getting that. He's vulnerable. He's not invincible. So psychologically, his strength is being sapped.
When we first saw it start, it looked like about 1,000 troops, about 20 tanks, and it looked like just a probing attack, see how far they could go, ideally probably to embarrass and humiliate President Putin. But they managed to roll back the Russian defenses pretty quickly. So they capitalized. It now looks likely to have 10,000 troops in that little enclave. It looks like they've blown 3 bridges. If they were planning to go any further, they wouldn't have blown those bridges. So it looks likely they're settling in and digging themselves in. The real surprise is why President Putin doesn't appear to have done anything about it. I think when we discussed before, one of the options was Putin, because he's Mr. Security, he would need to be seen to be dealing with this incursion firmly. I mean, let's be blunt. It's the first time that Russia's been invaded since 1941. So for a man who presents himself as Mr. Security, this is deeply humiliating. So the question is, why has he not reacted so far? And I think what's been interesting, a couple of answers to that. One of them, I come from military where we delegate down. So from our junior non-commissioned ranks, our corporals, our senior non-commissioned ranks, our sergeants, they are empowered to take control in a world of ambiguity. They understand commander's intent. When things happen that are a surprise, they get on and do something about it. Whereas in the Russian military, that's not the way they operate. Any surprises, they look to their boss and say, what do I do now, boss? Their bosses look to their bosses, and it cascades all the way up, in this case, almost certainly to President Putin. And that leads to a sort of strategic paralysis on the front line until the boss, President Putin, decides what to do. I still think there are two options, one of which is to crush the Ukrainians that are there. And that would take battle-hardened troops. Russia would have to move them from the front line. That would ease pressure on the front line, and that's exactly what Ukraine is probably hoping it'll do. The other option, which I think is playing out at the moment, is Russia has fixed 10,000 of Ukraine's best fighters in a portion of Russia. He doesn't have to do anything about it now. He can put a ring of steel around it, deal with that another day. Meanwhile, as a military guy, you're always focused on main effort. And what appears to be Russia's main effort is the special military operation, seize Crimea, the land bridge, and the Donbass. He's done most of that. There's a small area of the Donbass, relatively small, he hasn't yet taken. It looks like Putin is doubling down on that. Pokrovsk, Toretsk are the two areas of focus. And that means he's got 10 to 12 weeks this summer before the winter settles in. It becomes much more difficult to fight. And that's what appears to be what Putin is doing at the moment.
And it's interesting as well, he's got his mate Lukashenko in Belarus to assemble some troops on the border with Ukraine in Gomel Oblast of Belarus. So again, that's probably designed to try and divert some Ukrainian troops up there as well?
It could be. I have to say, having been watching this closely for the full scale of the war, you'll recall early on in the war, Russia had positioned troops in Belarus, and there were suggestions that they'd be mounting attacks out of Belarus. And actually using the Belarusian soldiers as part of that attack. The trouble is, Lukashenko is known as the last dictator in Europe. And it was pretty clear at the time that the Belarusian military said, this is not our war. We're not going to follow you in there. And if you do, that would cause all sorts of unrest and potentially lead to the end of Lukashenko. So I suspect Ukraine has discounted that as a serious threat. What Lukashenko is probably trying to do is he wants to be a buddy to President Putin. He wants to demonstrate that he's doing all he can by putting troops at the border. It just puts a little bubble of doubt in President Zelensky's mind. He's probably got to do something with his resources just to cover off that risk, even though it's very unlikely those troops would actually come in.
And President Zelensky has promised a response in turn. What do you think that could be? Could that be further drone attacks on Moscow? I mean, we've seen them in recent weeks. That would fit in with the wider strategy of trying to take the war to Russia.
It could be, James, but I think what President Zelensky's got to be very careful to do is to play this on his own terms. Classically, Russia is the larger combatant here. They've got more resources available, got greater wealth available, a bigger defense industrial base, more soldiers. So if Ukraine was simply to meet Russia on the battlefields of old and slug it out, Russia would win. So Ukraine has to find innovative ways to fight the battle. And that's what they're doing with this incursion. It's militarily, it doesn't actually make a great deal of sense because you're diverting troops away from the main effort. Why would you do that? Politically, it plays to the center of gravity of President Putin. Centers of gravity being things that one of the combatants just doesn't want to lose. And if Putin knows he's actually put in power by the oligarchs, the power base, if they think there's any chance of this war being lost, They are not currently able to holiday in Paris. They're not able to go across to London. There's all sorts of sanctions crippling their business, and Putin is now indicted by the International Criminal Court. The more that Zelensky can demonstrate to normal Russians that they're in a war, that this isn't just some foreign foray, that actually they are directly being affected, whether it's their young men predominantly and women being returned in boxes or without limbs, whether it's people being evacuated from the Kursk region, 150,000 people, they're going to talk as well. And all the sanctions, I think it all starts to pile up and potentially erode support for Putin.
Well, let's pick up on that. How would you assess the strength of his position domestically currently?
It's a very, very good question, James, and I'm impossibly ill-equipped to answer that. I think what we have seen in history is that dictatorial leaders get very, very swiftly replaced. It doesn't end well generally for dictatorial leaders. I think we saw with Yevgeny Prigozhin, who rode a tide, it felt, of public opinion that managed to get him further to Moscow than many would have expected. Putin will be worried about that. It's very difficult when Putin controls all the information, and largely for domestic Russians, it's a bit like in this country, you might have strong political views, but frankly, as long as it doesn't affect what you do each day, you get up, look after your kids, go down the pub, you don't really mind who's in power. Likewise in Russia, they'll believe whatever they're fed as long as they can get on with their lives, bring up their families in some sort of security. But over time, gradually, the narrative that Putin's coming out with does not connect with the number of people coming back in body bags that they're having to bury. Everybody will know somebody in a body bag. By way of context, in the Afghanistan war in the UK, only a few hundred were killed, several thousand were badly injured. But Help for Heroes created a huge bow wave across the country of sympathy for our servicemen and women. Just imagine multiplying that by 100, maybe 1,000. That's the impact this is having in domestic Russia. So all of this is gradually nibbling away at Putin's power base. When will it crumble? Who knows? But history shows these are often short, sharp shocks rather than through a process of osmosis.
That's a really good point. And you've also got the issue of not just people coming home in body bags, but also people being displaced from their homes and being evacuated in Belgorod and in Kursk as well. If you were General Starsky then, if you were the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's forces, what would you do now? Would you try and consolidate the land you've taken in Kursk? Or would you, in a few weeks' time or whenever, try and stage a tactical withdrawal?
Yeah, and that's a big question, isn't it? The problem with answering that question, James, is that you have to set that into the context of that's a tactical issue in a whole strategy for the country. If you look at it from a grand strategic perspective, the Ukrainian counteroffensive penciled in for last year didn't really work. Lots of Western support didn't work. This year, the much vaunted $60 billion of US aid that was meant to come in didn't. That left a hole. Russia got on the front foot. And bluntly, it was always going to be a very difficult summer for Ukraine. And that is where we stand at the moment. Ukraine is on the back foot. Russia is grinding forward. Yes, there's the Kursk intrusion. Yes, there are oil refineries in flames. You know, they've been having effect inside Russia. But bluntly, where it matters on the front line, Ukraine have been struggling. I think Starsky would be very keen to stabilize the front line, get to winter, and try then to consolidate and actually get back on the front foot again. I think what's been interesting, many of the briefings I get from defense officials and colleagues in Ukraine, is that neither side really has the capability for a decisive breakthrough this year. Russia, bluntly, has been losing at times up to 1,600 servicemen a day. Compare that with the battles of last year, Bakhmut particularly. Well, that was less than 1,000 a day, and that was described as the most brutal battle since World War II. So 1,600 a day is far more. And even now, Russia is losing over 1,000 a day. Why does that matter? Well, Russia does not want to mobilize again. That would have a profound implication for Putin's power base. He has been trying to recruit people from overseas with a big bounty and lots of money salary-wise. Initially, that worked, but a lot of them were sent straight to the front line and got killed. Funny old thing, far significantly fewer are now recruiting, less than 1,000 a day. So Russia is not sustainable position in terms of manpower. Neither is Ukraine. Both sides are grinding themselves to a bit of a stalemate this year. And in the absence of any breakthrough, I suspect it'll be winter when everybody will have a little catch their breath. Unfortunately, that times with the US presidential elections. And if President Trump arrives, then I suspect President Putin will be rubbing his hands in glee to see if there's some sort of deal to be done.
Frontline's in-depth coverage of the war in Ukraine is made possible by Times Radio. Please help support our work by downloading the Times Radio app, the link's on screen now, and tuning in through the day to keep up to date with the latest news and thought-provoking discussions.
Karma exists, like, for real, and those who bring war to a foreign country, they are doomed to bring it back home. And that's exactly what we see in Kursk. Even though, the people in the Kursk Oblast, and we have plenty of reports from this area, from Ukrainian journalists, from international journalists, everybody can see that Ukrainian army is not Russian army. It's civilized. It provides locals with humanitarian supplies, etc., etc. But the main point is that Putin, that is extremely crazy about his plan of capturing whole Ukraine. He cannot provide enough protection and enough defense for his own citizens. Currently, there was I would say, a big group of Russians located just northwest of Suja, and they were in this pocket river on the north, the Ukrainian army on the south and east. They were locked in this pocket, and as of this moment, we have information that Ukrainian armed forces managed to secure the gap on the eastern flank, where they could either escape from this trap or receive supplies. So currently, the only way those Russians can escape from this trap prepared by the Ukrainian armed forces is, of course, using pontoons across the river. But we have effective control over this river using our artillery and our drones. Just as I mentioned like a week ago, we can control those areas. We can destroy the pontoons with our artillery and strike drones. So currently, it's estimated that approximately 1,000 Russian troops are still locked there. According to different sources, there's between 700 and 3,000 people. But according to my estimates, there's about 1,000 Russian regular troops, including conscripts. Also, we saw that it was, a big proof of just how efficient, how effective Ukrainian OPSEC is, because nobody knew much about this operation before it started, even though we have information that Russians had clues about possible incursion approximately 2 weeks before it happened, but Putin didn't do anything to prevent it. So even though they had information, they didn't react. They just ignored it.
And do you think we may see further cross-border raids into Russia? I mean, there has been some activity in recent weeks in Belgorod. Do you think we might see more of that?
Belgorod, Bryansk, we saw several probably attempts of attack. There may be some reconnaissance action taking place because Russian monitoring channels reported that Ukrainian troops were spotted in that area, sometimes involving tanks, heavy armored vehicles. So it is possible that we will also see some scenario like it happened in Suja, for example, in the neighboring territories in Bryansk Oblast and possibly Belgorod Oblast as well.
I wanted to ask you about Russia's manpower problem, because it seems to me like Putin is in a really difficult situation whereby he's got a huge casualty rate on the front line in Ukraine. He's got conscripts now fighting on the front line in Kursk, and a lot of those are quite poorly trained. He's got
an issue whereby he doesn't want to stage further mobilization because of the political problems that might cause him at home, and he doesn't want to divert troops to Kursk from the front line in Ukraine. So we're hearing about the Russian authorities now setting up new volunteer defense task forces. And having spent months, if not years, talking about the high Russian casualty rate, but basically Russia have been able to get away with it until now because Putin is happy to send people into the meat grinder. Are we now at the point where the Russian casualty rate is really starting to cause an issue for Vladimir Putin? Is this the point where he can't get away with it any longer?
I would say, unfortunately, it's not enough. Not only for Putin, but also for the civilians, for the people populating the terrorist federation. Unfortunately, it's not enough. And my personal prediction for after this incursion happened is that Putin will probably not use this big number of conscripts that he currently has in his possession across the Russian Federation. There's approximately 200,000 Russian conscripts that he can use at any time. A lot of predictions were made by different people, different opinion makers, that he will most probably use those conscripts in order to fight the Ukrainian armed forces in the area. But to me personally, it doesn't seem so, because using conscripts always results in Russian mothers protesting and things like that. That is something that he doesn't want to show to public. Something that he wants to keep secret from his general population. That's why I think that he may still sacrifice some territory in Kursk, maybe in Belgorod. But he will be using more and more mobilized people, his regular troops, in order to fight it, because Russians don't care about two things. It's human life and it's time. They don't really care about those things. It will, of course, slow down their offensive operations, for example, in Zaporizhia and Kharkiv, but they don't care much about time. They will keep pushing, no matter the casualties, and no matter maybe 2 years, 3 years additionally that they will spend on this invasion of Ukraine. They don't care much about it.
It's obviously been a very encouraging few weeks for Ukraine since the incursion into Kursk, but it is worth noting Russia continues to make some incremental gains around Pokrovsk. How concerned are you about that?
We are pretty much concerned about it, but we saw the same situation in Pokrovsk last month. There's a lot of people criticizing the incursion of Kursk because they believe that it led to losing the territory in the Pokrovsk direction. But, for example, Ocheretina, the situation there was also hard even before the incursion of Kursk happened, and it didn't change much since that moment. A lot of military, even in that area, in the Pokrovsk direction that I talked with, they say that even despite the fact that they still have to slowly retreat back, inflicting casualties to the Russian personnel, but the operation in Kursk is still really, really important. And the route for those guys currently on the Russian territory, the Ukrainian soldiers.
It's really interesting when people debate what the primary objective of the Kursk incursion was. And, some people say it's about diverting Russian troops. Other people say it's about taking the war physically to Putin. I increasingly wonder whether it was also designed to send a message to Ukraine's Western allies of, look, we can physically cross a red line. We can physically invade Russia. And the worst case scenario that the West is worried about, of Putin, for example, using tactical nuclear weapons, will not come to pass. And we don't want to be complacent about that, but it certainly hasn't come to pass so far. Do you agree with that? Do you think in part it was designed to send that message to the West?
It was one of the goals. One of the goals was to show Western society that we are not afraid of Russian invaders, and we will be fighting them on their territory, because in the end, Adolf Hitler, for example, was not captured like in Ukraine or in Russia. He was captured in Berlin, right? That's why we have to go there. But like, you know, hypothetically. But another important goal of this incursion was that Russians are using their territory. Russians using their missile complexes, mobile and stationary missile complexes, in order to launch their missiles at Ukrainian cities. They launched their attack drones from Kursk Oblast, from Belgorod, and unfortunately, our allies protect, those agreements with other Western allies at times protect Ukrainian airplanes and Russian airplanes and Russian missiles more than they protect Ukrainian sky. Unfortunately, that's a fact. That's why it was an attempt to say that, okay, we cannot use long-range weapons to strike those targets. We will just go and make sure that they stop killing Ukrainian civilians, and that's what we're doing right now. Of course, from the Kursk territory, it's much easier to strike those targets located there, in just 70 kilometers away from our armed forces, and that's exactly what we can see. Even until today, Russians still keep launching their strike drones from Kursk Oblast, but we saw it happening like this week during those drone strikes on Ukraine. They were still launching them from Kursk. So if we are not allowed to use our weapons to strike them from Ukrainian territory, from safe distance, then we have no other choice but to go there ourselves.
I mean, we will see whether the US and other Western allies of Ukraine loosen some of those restrictions in the weeks and months to come. Certainly President Zelensky and many Ukrainians will be hoping so. I just wonder whether Zelensky and General Siersky might be considering using some of those weapons anyway, even without their permission, in the same way that the Kursk incursion, as far as we know, did not have any prior approval by the White House, for instance, and it's better almost to seek forgiveness than ask permission. And I wonder whether Ukraine might now feel emboldened to use, for example, the Storm Shadow missiles or long-range ATACMS to hit some of those military targets inside Russia without the West's permission. And once that red line has been crossed, and you'd hope there isn't some massive escalation by Russia, well, maybe the West will just fundamentally change its position. Do you think that may happen?
Well, situation is not that critical yet, to use all we can without permission. But of course, Ukrainian president and Ukrainian general staff, they keep their word. Because unlike Russians, for example, we respect agreements. And there is another situation that not a lot of people talk about, is that situation with the military aid to Ukraine is critical at this point, because a lot of things that were promised to Ukraine in 2023 or 2022, they are not yet delivered. For example, the Patriot batteries, the Patriot systems that were promised by the United States like years ago, I believe, they were not delivered yet. It takes a lot of time for reasons nobody can explain to deliver that absolutely necessary military aid. Some of it is promised to be delivered to Ukraine in like 2027, even though we needed it yesterday, literally. And it's very easy to lose even that tiny support that we have. People that believe that Ukraine is like massively brought all kinds of weapons, American taxes parachuted over people and things like that, tanks, Abramses, hundreds of armored vehicles, they are deluded. They don't understand that Ukraine was only brought a fraction of the aid that was promised. And this is, again, something we should talk about, because Ukrainians need this aid yesterday. And we really hope that our allies will finally understand that if they don't help Ukraine right now with everything our army requires to protect our citizens, they will need to think about ways to somehow protect themselves against Russian aggressor in the future.
That's a really good point you raised, because you're right, there's been so much talk in recent weeks, understandably, about the incursion, and also before that about the delivery of the F-16s. But, it's some of the basics. It is like the Patriot missile systems. It is the air defenses that you really, really need at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to talk about it as much as possible, I believe, in the media, in the social media, because even though we are big friends, we became big friends with our Western allies, etc., but we still need to remind them from time to time what is reality, right? So it's really, really important to remember.
Are you more optimistic now about the weakness of Vladimir Putin's personal position? You have now got certain people, Russian military bloggers, criticizing him. You've obviously got some of the locals in Kursk and Belgorod who are expressing frustration about the Russian response. Reports some of the oligarchs around him are agitating as well. Are you feeling more optimistic that he might be in a weaker position than previously thought?
Well, of course, situations like this, they bring some satisfaction to me as a Ukrainian and former Ukrainian military, because when there's new problems emerging for Russia's command, like those bloggers criticizing Putin and things like that, of course, it requires them to stretch their resources and to dedicate some of their efforts to deal with other problems. And that's exactly what we need. I believe the more problems they have there in Russia in terms of military, in terms of informational warfare, I believe the more the better.
This whole operation has been portrayed in Western media as a massive gamble by the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, General Starsky, and one that might perhaps seal his legacy after things like the Battle of Bakhmut, the withdrawal from Avdiivka, the grueling attritional combat you've seen in the Donbass. I was interested that if that is so important, that the kind of lack of enthusiasm that you said that you experienced by the people who were actually taking you into this area.
Well, Pokrovsk is going to be a very interesting element going forward and very concerning for the Ukrainians. If this was truly to divert attention away from that area of the front line, I was here in February for the anniversary, and they had just lost Avdiivka, which is about 15 miles to the southeast of Pokrovsk. So this march has been steady, and it sounds like there's been some tipping points lately. Ukrainians lost a lot of territory, and the Russians are moving into areas where the defenses aren't as well placed. If they break through, it severs some pretty important supply lines. The concern for the Ukrainians, and part of why, when you zoom out, why would they go into Kursk anyways, is they're looking at the 600-mile plus front line that in areas looks like Pokrovsk, in areas it's just quiet, and it looks like rolling fields and not a lot of active fighting taking place. If they can manage so far north, just talking geographically, if they can manage to divert attention so far north, all of the specialized Russian equipment, some of the armor, the APCs that maybe they might need to move into this area, it's going to take a lot of time for them, the Russians, to pull it out of the southeast and move it into the north. And it's going to be taking place on railways. It's going to be taking place on roads that potentially could be exposed at certain points and could be hit by the Ukrainians. Have we been seeing that? It's kind of too hard. It's too early to say whether or not that's actually been taking place. But I think this is just purely a geography and a numbers game at this point for the Ukrainians. Pull some of those resources away from the southeast, expose them, and then as they're moving into the north, you've got potentially a better chance with some of this new Ukrainian equipment and the fighter jets, the F-16s that they have now, to be able to strike some of this.
When you talk about the actual operation into Kursk, the general consensus has been it is really too early to say what's going to happen and how long it's going to last. From your visit, though, did you get any insight there? Did you get any clear understanding?
Yeah, I think it's going to last quite a while. I would not be surprised if, we just saw on open source data satellite images, and the whole question was whether or not the Ukrainians are actually building defenses in Kursk. Are they building the trenches and the pillboxes? And we've seen satellite data now that shows that they are about 5 miles north of where we were visiting. So that's the kind of thing that says we're in this for the long haul. If they try and hold this area, it's not very easy for the Russians to make advances because it's just flat rolling hills and farmland and a lot of wide open spaces. So it seems like a relatively safe move for the Ukrainians to move into this particular area and try and defend it. Do they commit? I mean, as much resources as the Russians are reportedly, according to the Ukrainians, going to move into this area, 30,000 troops? Probably not. They don't have that kind of manpower for really anywhere on the front line to move 30,000 troops anywhere like the Russians potentially could. The Russian media has already, the military bloggers, the state media, they're already claiming that there are 6,000 Ukrainian soldiers who've died trying to take Kursk. That couldn't be anywhere farther than the truth. I mean, in Sumy in particular, where that's the route to come back from Kursk, this is a major Ukrainian city, there would have been images of the dead piling up, being brought back on trucks. I mean, and we don't see that. When you talk to people in Sumy, this caught them by surprise too on the Ukrainian side. I mean, the residents there now are suddenly bumping shoulders with a bunch of soldiers who weren't there before a few weeks ago. And the civilians had no idea that this was coming. And now they're a bit on the apprehensive side as well, because they're concerned. They think, wow, this fight was in our southeast for a long time, and now it's really on my doorstep.
And now that you're out of Ukrainian occupied Russia and you're back in Ukraine, what is your takeaway from this particular reporting trip?
I think the takeaway here is that the Zelensky team has a plan, that they know there could be an end game on their side to this war, and they started to initiate it. I think this is them trying to going on the offensive after being on the defensive for years is obviously a major shakeup. But at the same time, we get announcements that Ukraine has a new ballistic weapon. Ukraine has a new jet-powered drone. Ukraine is now going to approach the Biden, the Trump, and the Harris teams with a plan for ending the war next month. Those are the kind of things that seem, and the reading on the wall is they really want to find a way to get this conflict to a resolution somehow. But it all kind of funnels down to, and I think this is where the Zelensky equation is going, especially with his comments towards the United States. It's funneling down to, at the end of the day, we cannot win this conflict with Putin in power. How do we get Putin out of power? So they're pushing every pressure point they possibly can, hitting all these oil depots. We've just seen from the Kyiv Post reporting today that Russian oil production numbers are now no longer going to be made public. I think this is exactly what the Ukrainians are trying to do. Hit everywhere where Putin potentially could be destabilized, lose power. Is that something the Americans want to see? Do they want to see regime change? There's probably a lot of apprehension about seeing a Putin faltering and falling eventually. But at the same time, I mean, we had these same fears in '91 when the Soviet Union was collapsing and regime change was happening, and everybody made it out of there roughly okay. So that's the argument I think we're seeing the Zelensky team make is, give us a chance. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Just, we need some weapons. We need the ability to strike deep inside Russian territory, hit these air bases, and then we can put Putin on the hot seat. It's remarkable that he's not there already. I mean, the number of embarrassments for his entire operation by now it's an incredible list.
And just finally, Zach, a number of foreign journalists have been accused of illegal entry into Russia, having done what you've just done. Criminal cases have been launched against them. What makes the risk worth it to you?
That's a good question. I don't know that I have very much fear about the being at odds with the Putin regime. In Israel, I've been spending a lot of time with Russians and with Ukrainians who are Israel has a massive diaspora of both those populations. And we talk about the war frequently. We talk about what kind of access and ability that everyday Russians have, especially the ones like me that went to school, went to university, they're in their 20s, and they're trying to live their lives, build their own lives. And for those Russians living abroad, the Russia that they described to me, a place where you're unable to post what you want to because the FSB might come knocking at your door, or you have a friend who's had some personal encounters with the FSB and the stories they tell are horrifying. I don't want to ever be a part of or ever come close to being in a society or a military state where the citizens are deprived of their freedoms as extreme as Russian citizens are deprived of theirs. And if that means that I can never go to Russia as a result of this, then I am more than pleased for that to be the final outcome. I think that the main thing going forward is, does Russia try and target us personally and try and make our lives hell going forward? I think that there's a couple of avenues that they could try and do that, and will be interesting to see what really happens to some of us. Because they're still a member of Interpol and participate in the international intelligence sharing community and can claim whatever they want. And I think that that's going to be the most interesting thing. I've also been paying really close attention to my cell phone of late because there's been a couple of moments where it's frizzed out or done things that I wasn't expecting, and I have to calm myself down and remind myself that it's probably not somebody on the other end trying to get in, but you never know. It's the Russian Federation. They've been doing a lot of crazy things for years.
And Zach, you're there, but you have just returned from Kursk Oblast in Russia, where you've been on a reporting trip to see how the Ukrainian offensive there has been going. How did you get there, first of all?
We were in Sumy, and a armored vehicle took us across the border. There's a lot of restrictions about what we can and cannot film. The amount of Ukrainian equipment that was moving in the direction with us was really impressive. And I think it spoke to how the Ukrainians regard this counteroffensive as a now real element of how they're going to create this end game strategy for the conflict here, that this is going to play a major role. The movement in was a little tense because the route, we're going into Russian territory, right? And the route is one I've never been down. I've never been along this point of the front line. I have no familiarity with the area, and it's very exposed. We can see through the tiny windows of this pressurized armor vehicle the fields, just beautiful rolling fields and agriculture, and just thinking to yourself, man, we are really, really exposed on our way in. The fear that I have in that moment is perhaps everything we've been reading about where the Ukrainians are actually situated, how deep into Kursk they've actually gone. We don't know how solidified those front lines have become, or if they're building defenses deep, far away that would keep the Russians from getting anywhere close to launching anything that could strike us and kill us in a road like that. And of course, the FPV drone. So it's tense, but we get into Suja, which is one of the first areas that the Ukrainians bursted through the border checkpoint, captured, surrendering Russian POWs, and then pushed into Suja. And not very much damage to speak of. When we talk about Russians coming into Ukrainian towns, it's flattened, it's leveled. But the Ukrainians on this trip made a real point to show us that, hey, we came into this area and we were engaged with Russian forces. But look, we didn't destroy homes. We didn't destroy community centers. There's obviously a lot of damage in the building in the center of town where that Lenin statue was, but that's where the Russians were hiding at the time. And civilians had been fleeing the area. So it was really a surreal experience.
How do you assess the strength of his position in Moscow? I appreciate he has obviously complete control of the political structures there, but he will be a paranoid man and he'll be worried about his position all the time. So do you think that the threat level against him has risen in recent weeks?
Well, he's made a point of keeping loyalists in positions, including at the top of the armed forces, which is why Gerasimov, who really has not had a very good war at all, their commander-in-chief, is still there. And those figures who opposed him coming out of the of the military conflict. Prigozhin last summer, the head of Wagner, Surovikin, who supported Prigozhin, if only indirectly, and was by far their best and most effective general, is basically been retired now. So he watches that. And then you've got the technocrats. I mean, as has been remarked a number of times, he's got lousy generals, but he's got very good economists. And they've really done an impressive job keeping the Russian economy afloat, managing the currency and all these things. But you can see they're feeling pretty tested by it all now as well. So this is why, and you saw yesterday, Zelensky was talking about a theory of victory, which you may think is optimistic, but it was clear he wasn't just relying on military means to achieve it. It's economic, which is why they keep on going for oil depots and refineries. It's political, diplomatic, which is why he had Indian Prime Minister Modi visiting and gave him as big a hug as Modi had given Putin, and so on. It's a whole series of things that add to the pressure. And when this works, if at all, it's very hard for us over here to say.
How should the West treat this moment? Is this now the time for the West to further loosen restrictions on how Western-supplied weapons can be used inside Russia?
I think so. And this is a long-running debate, and it's gone through many stages. I think initially the administration was nervous that one way or the other they were going to get drawn into a shooting war with Russia, and that would be very dangerous. And I think most analysts would probably agree with that. That's very dangerous. But you don't, and Putin, when he was actually making his more serious nuclear threats, it was about NATO coming in side by side with Ukraine. Every other red line they've talked about has now been passed. New countries joining NATO, F-16s are now flying in Ukraine. Russian territory is regularly being attacked. Long-range systems have been provided. All of these things have happened, and the war carries on without it turning into the Third World War. And so now we've got this one particular thing of whether or not Ukraine can use the longer range American systems and the British Storm Shadow, French Scalp, that cruise missiles that have American components in them to attack targets deep in Russia. The Ukrainians want to attack air bases. It's very reasonable, it seems to me, that they should be able to do so. So the pressure is building up on that. Note that the Ukrainians have now got a pretty impressive long-range drone that they're starting to use, and they announced yesterday that they've tested a ballistic missile. In the Soviet days, Ukraine built lots of missiles. It had a big defense industry. So I think that is, over time, the Ukrainians will do it themselves. But it seems to me unfortunate at this stage in the war that the Americans and the Ukrainians aren't wholly in lockstep about what's needed to do to get this war over.
And do you think Zelensky has a point? I mean, I think a lot of Ukrainians are frustrated when they feel as if their allies have been one step behind throughout this entire conflict. That, first they were told you couldn't have tanks, then they got tanks, then they were told you couldn't have F-16s, and they've got F-16s. Now they're asking to use longer range missiles inside Russia. My sense is probably the West will move on it, but they might say we could have moved on it a year ago.
Yeah, I think that view is very strongly held. I mean, the Americans now are saying less about worrying about Russian red lines and more whether this is the right priority. It's not masses of the long range systems around. There are useful things to attack. Where the Americans don't mind, the Americans don't care if Crimea is attacked, because although the Russians think Crimea is Russian, the Americans and the Ukrainians don't, and so on, which indicates just this blurring of the boundaries here. So there are questions about priorities, but I think you get around that by having conversations on what makes sense, what it is that you, how the Ukraine can be best supported in what it's trying to do. There's another argument which is a bit retrospective, which is that in practice, this has all been very incremental, and so the Russians at each stage have been confronted with a line that's being crossed, but isn't quite worth raising the whole temperature themselves about. It seems a small thing, and then another small thing happens. So it's the incrementalism has made it easier to increase support for Ukraine without getting into a major crisis with Russia. Again, I think there's some truth in that argument, but the fact is that the Ukrainians are paying daily the costs of this war, and so long as the Ukrainians think that they can subjugate the Ukrainians, they'll carry on, and somehow they've got to be disabused of that notion. And out of the blue, really, most people were quite surprised by this. On 6th of August, they launched an attack into Russia, into Kursk. And this got the Russians by surprise, got the Americans by surprise, got a lot of Ukrainians by surprise. They've kept this going now for 3 weeks. They've taken a substantial chunk of territory. They're still expanding pretty slowly now. And though the Russians are starting to fight back, it's going to take quite a long time before the Russians can muster the force and organize it to push them out. Meanwhile, the Russians haven't stopped where they're strong, and indeed their advance has picked up pace. So the war is rather curiously poised at the moment. You've got a very strong push by the Russians, which may see some success quite soon. But you've also got this new initiative by the Ukrainians, which complicates Russian strategy enormously, because it's embarrassing for Putin to have Ukrainians occupying a bit of Russia. Meanwhile, you've also got attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, really severe ones on Monday and Tuesday, and Ukraine is fighting back by hitting Russian oil. So there's a lot of tit for tat going on at the moment. Nobody quite in a position to move towards a victory, but a lot of damage and destruction.
Are you clear what the primary objective from a Ukrainian point of view was with the incursion? Was it designed to divert Russian troops? Was it designed to humiliate Putin? Or was it primarily designed to send a message to Ukraine's Western allies of, look, we can physically invade Russia, and all of Putin's talk about red lines will be shown to be a bluff?
I think all of those things. It was, I think, partly morale sounds like it's not a very good reason, but actually it's not unimportant. They had to show that they could do something, and just to relieve the pressure. Secondly, and President Zelensky talked about this yesterday, he wants to create a buffer of some sort. There's an issue about whether the Ukrainians feared another Russian invasion coming through either Kharkiv or Sumy. They tried one in Kharkiv a few months ago, which didn't actually go very well. But the Ukrainians now say they want a buffer of some sort to make those sort of incursions harder. I think they really do want the Russians to move troops out of Ukraine, and some have already moved out of Ukraine. But fortunately for the Ukrainians, not quite the ones that they would wish, the ones carrying on the main offensive at the moment. So I think there were a number of reasons why they wanted to do it. They also, again, this is not minor, they've taken 500 to 600 prisoners, and many of them conscripts, and they've already swapped well over 100 of those for Ukrainian prisoners. So they call it their exchange fund. You don't get much out of the Russians unless you've got something to offer in return.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more, click subscribe on our YouTube channel. You can listen to Times Radio, and you can read more about the war in Ukraine and global security with your Times digital subscription.